Some of the most telling moments in any true crime documentary are not the courtroom confrontations or the dramatic legal reversals, but the ordinary ones that came just before everything changed. Case 1. Devan Schreiner. This is the terrifying account of a young Colorado mother who allegedly stalked a man's daily work route for weeks, tracked his every movement in real time, and then walked up to him in broad daylight on a public street and shot him multiple times in front of his own mail truck while neighbors watched in horror. She was 26 years old when the shooting took place on October 13, 2021. Jason Schaefer was the victim of this story. He was a 33-year-old postal carrier and father in Longmont, Colorado, a man whose only mistake, it seems, was being predictable. But what truly pushed Devan Schreiner to execute a plan this terrifyingly precise? Let's jump into the details of this case to find out. Jason Schaefer was 33 years old, a United States Postal Service carrier working a route through the southwest neighborhoods of Longmont, Colorado. He was a father. People who knew him described him as well-liked, a familiar presence on the street, someone who did his job quietly and consistently. On that October afternoon, shortly after noon, he stopped his mail truck near a group of neighborhood mailboxes on Heather Hill Street, close to Renaissance Drive. It was a routine stop. Within moments, witnesses heard 5 gunshots. Devan Schreiner, who was 26 at the time, had not arrived in that neighborhood by accident. She and Jason had been in a romantic relationship years earlier. They had a son together, born around 2015. Both had worked for the Postal Service in the Longmont area, a shared professional background that would later become significant in a way neither could have anticipated when they first took those jobs. By the fall of 2021, the relationship was long over, but what had replaced it was something considerably more volatile, a custody dispute over their child that had become entrenched and increasingly hostile. In the days immediately preceding October 13th, Jason had filed legal documents seeking expanded parenting time. Prosecutors at Schreiner's trial would later argue that this filing registered in her mind as a threat she was unwilling to accept. By this point, Schreiner had entered a relationship with Andrew Ritchie, a 36-year-old known as AJ. The evidence assembled by investigators established that Schreiner had raised the idea of harming Jason on more than one occasion before October of 2021, and that Ritchie had moved from the role of listener to active co-conspirator in the months that followed. There was also the reported development that Jason had begun a relationship with a member of Schreiner's own family, a detail prosecutors included in their picture of the grievances accumulating on Schreiner's side of this conflict. She had come to view him, they argued, not as a co-parent, but as an obstacle, and she had begun to treat the problem in those terms. Her familiarity with postal operations was not incidental to what followed. She had worked for the service. She understood how routes functioned, how timing worked, how a carrier's position on any given afternoon could be anticipated and tracked. On the day of the attack, Ritchie served as a live monitor, following Jason's movements along his route and relaying his location back to Schreiner in real time. Schreiner, in turn, had taken deliberate steps to muddy the electronic record of her own whereabouts, leaving her phone and her mail tracker at Ritchie's residence during the window of the attack. It was the kind of detail that does not appear in spontaneous crimes. The confrontation itself was brief. Schreiner approached Jason on foot at the mailboxes, while he stood beside his truck. She opened fire. He was struck multiple times and collapsed near the mailboxes. Neighbors who responded to the sound of the shots found him there. First responders attempted to help him but could not. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Schreiner fled immediately in her black SUV. The mail truck remained at the curb. The investigation moved with uncommon speed. Witnesses had observed the vehicle. What Ritchie later admitted to investigators, combined with the physical evidence and digital trail, established the outline of the conspiracy in ways that left prosecutors with a substantial case. Both Schreiner and Ritchie were charged with first-degree murder. The cases were tried separately. Schreiner's trial opened in Boulder County District Court in March of 2023. District Attorney Michael Dougherty led the prosecution, presenting the attack as the product of months of planning, a coordinated ambush involving surveillance, logistics, and premeditated efforts to conceal her involvement. The defense, led by Jennifer Engelman, did not dispute the core fact that Schreiner had fired the shots. Their argument focused instead on mental state. They contended that Ritchie had manipulated and influenced her to a degree that diminished her individual responsibility for the outcome. The jury was unpersuaded. After roughly 8 hours of deliberation, they returned a verdict of first-degree murder after deliberation. Judge Patrick Butler immediately applied the mandatory sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. Ritchie's separate trial concluded in September of 2023 with the same verdict. Both remain in the Colorado Department of Corrections. Colorado abolished capital punishment in 2020, so neither face the prospect of execution. The mandatory sentence for first-degree murder in the state is life without parole, and that is what each received. Jason Schaefer's mother was awarded custody of the couple's son following the verdicts. The child at the center of the custody dispute, whose father had sought additional parenting time in the legal filings that prosecutors identified as a precipitating factor, lost that father permanently because of the actions taken to prevent exactly that outcome. How a child makes sense of something like this as they grow older is a question no verdict and no sentence can address. Schaefer's family spoke at sentencing about what had been taken from them. They had had time to choose their words carefully. What stayed with those who heard them was not any particular phrase, but the weight behind all of it, the awareness that this had been preventable, that it had been chosen, and that the son who had once been the subject of a custody disagreement was now the child of a man who had been killed on a public street while delivering mail. He deserved better than all of it. If you enjoy videos like this, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Case 2. Stacy Rodriguez. At the time of this crime, Stacy Rodriguez, a 19-year-old Colorado woman, allegedly followed a man she had just met at a bar back to his own home, and before the sun came up, she had beaten him to death with a metal tool, ransacked his bedroom, and helped set his house on fire with his body still inside it. She was 19 years old when it happened, in the early hours of October 3, 2021. Christopher Dickerson, a 35-year-old Greeley man, was the unfortunate victim of this story. Christopher was just days away from his birthday and who had simply invited 2 women he met that night back to his home. What makes this case so deeply contested is that Rodriguez looked a jury in the eyes and said she had acted in self-defense, and the jury had to decide whether the burns, the blood, and the stolen belongings told the same story she did. But what really happened inside that house on 15th Avenue Court? Let's jump into the details of this case to find out. Stacy Rodriguez was 19 years old in October of 2021. Her acquaintance, Hosanna Varela, was 23. The women encountered Dickerson during the course of a late evening that moved between several bars in the Greeley downtown area. Dickerson had been socializing on his own earlier in the night. The three connected in the bar environment, and Dickerson eventually allowed the women to follow him to his residence at 2417 15th Avenue Court. They arrived in the early hours of October 3rd, following his vehicle in Varela's Chevrolet Malibu. Whatever Dickerson believed the evening still held at that point is something only he could have told anyone, and he was not alive to tell it. What happened inside the house is a matter of contested accounts, though not of contested outcome. Surveillance footage and phone data established the timeline of movements with considerable precision. Rodriguez later testified in her own defense that a dispute broke out, that Dickerson became angry and aggressive when the women attempted to leave, and that she struck him with a metal tool, a rat tail file, in a moment of fear for her safety. She described a physical confrontation, a perceived threat, a panicked response. She testified that she had not planned any of this, that she had acted out of self-preservation in a situation she had not anticipated and could not escape. She also described attempting to use other items as protection before the situation escalated. Her account, in its broad structure, was the account of someone who had found themselves in a dangerous situation not of their own design. Prosecutors found this account irreconcilable with the evidence. They presented Hosanna Varela's testimony, given after Varela pleaded guilty to her own role in subsequent events, in which Varela stated that she had never felt personally threatened by Dickerson that evening, that he had not been aggressive toward the women in the way Rodriguez described, and that the confrontation, whatever its exact contours, did not justify what followed. The autopsy established that Dickerson had been struck multiple times in the neck with the metal file, severing a major artery. He died before the fire in his home was set. The burn patterns confirmed the sequence. Dickerson was already gone when the living room ignited. What followed the killing extended the legal consequences substantially. The two women searched the bedroom, went through his belongings, and took items from the home, including what appeared to be jewelry. His wallet was left behind in his vehicle, but his cell phone was removed and its location data later traced toward areas associated with Varela's family. The fire was started shortly before 5:30 in the morning by a figure who re-entered the house after the women had initially left. Neighbors saw the glow from a living room window. By the time emergency services arrived, the home had been fully engulfed. Dickerson's body was found near the entrance. The fire had been set to obscure what had happened inside, and the arson charge reflected exactly that. Both women were arrested in November of 2021. Varela eventually entered a guilty plea to arson and related charges, receiving 32 years. She agreed to testify against Rodriguez in exchange for the murder charge being dismissed. Rodriguez's trial in Weld County District Court lasted approximately 3 weeks, beginning in February of 2025. Her self-defense claim was the central argument the jury had to evaluate. Was the killing a panicked response to a genuine threat, or was it an unjustified act of violence against a man who had invited the women into his home and ended up paying for it with his life? The jury evaluated the competing accounts for what the evidence supported, and on March 12th or 14th of 2025, accounts differ slightly on the precise date, they convicted Rodriguez on all counts: first-degree murder, first-degree arson, tampering with a deceased person, and 2 counts of second-degree burglary. Judge Vicente Vigil sentenced her immediately, life without the possibility of parole for the murder, plus additional consecutive years for the other charges. Reports from the courtroom noted that Rodriguez's demeanor at the reading of the verdict drew comment from prosecutors, who described it as callous. The victim's father, Alan Dickerson, said his son did not deserve to die the day he befriended those 2 young women. That sentence holds the whole of it. There are questions this case raises that the verdict cannot fully settle. Self-defense claims and situations involving late-night encounters between strangers are among the hardest for a jury to parse. The absence of witnesses to the initiating moment, the presence of alcohol, the competing accounts of who said or did what first. But the evidence that the jury weighed, Varela's testimony that she felt no threat, the number and nature of the injuries Dickerson sustained, the deliberate steps taken afterward to erase the record of what had occurred, pointed in one direction. Rodriguez was 23 years old at conviction. She will spend the foreseeable future of her life in a Colorado prison for what happened inside a house on a street in Greeley in the early hours of a Saturday morning in October of 2021. Case 3. Alicia Elena Valdez. Imagine stepping out of your house for 20 minutes to pick up dinner and never coming back. Not because of anything you did, but simply because of where you parked your car. Alicia Elena Valdez, a 19-year-old Colorado woman, helped plan and execute a series of armed street robberies and ended up legally responsible for the fatal shooting of a complete stranger who had simply stepped out of his house to pick up a takeout order for his girlfriend. She was 19 years old when the crime took place on April 5, 2018. Her victim was Andrew Janicek, a 27-year-old finance graduate, animal lover, and guitar player from the Edgewater area of Denver, shot once through the chest in a parking lot he had only stopped at because someone wanted barbecue for dinner. What makes this case especially heartbreaking is that Andrew was not robbed of a single thing. His wallet was still on his body. His killers left empty-handed, and he left in an ambulance that could not save him. But how did Alicia Valdez end up in that parking lot that night, and what was going through her mind? Let's jump into the details of this case to find out. Alicia Elena Valdez was 19 years old in April of 2018. Her co-conspirators were Caleb Joseph Vigil, also 19, and Devin Drist Howard, 20. The 3 had acquired a 9mm handgun in the days before April 5th, not for any specific personal conflict, but with the explicit intent to commit robberies, armed takeovers of strangers in public places, quick and violent, aimed at generating cash. Prosecutors described the acquisition of the weapon and the plan to use it as deliberate rather than impulsive. The group had discussed what they intended to do and had obtained the means to do it before any particular victim had been identified. Janicek was not chosen for any reason. He was simply present. His errand for takeout placed him outside in a public parking lot at the wrong moment, and that was enough. Vigil approached Janicek at gunpoint and demanded his wallet. Janacek initially complied. He dropped the wallet or handed it over, but then reached for the weapon. In the confrontation that followed, Vigil fired once. The single shot struck Janacek in the chest. Vigil then fled back to the waiting sedan, owned by Valdez and driven by Howard, and as the vehicle accelerated away from the scene, Howard drove it over Janacek's body. Janacek collapsed in the parking lot. A witness attempted CPR. He was pronounced dead at the scene. His wallet and his phone were found on or near his body. The robbery had failed entirely. Nothing had been taken. Andrew Janacek had been killed, and his killers left the parking lot with nothing they had come for. The felony murder doctrine was the legal mechanism by which Valdez's role in the crime translated into a first-degree murder conviction.
Under that doctrine, a participant in certain felonies, including attempted aggravated robbery, bears legal responsibility for a death that occurs during the commission of that felony, even without direct evidence that they fired a weapon or intended that a specific person would die. Valdez had provided the getaway vehicle, participated in the planning that produced the armed attempt, and was present throughout the criminal sequence. That was sufficient under Colorado law for the jury to hold her fully accountable for what happened to Andrew Janacek, regardless of whether she had pulled the trigger herself. The group was arrested on April 8, 2018 during a Denver police traffic stop linked to the vehicle and to a separate shooting investigation involving Howard. The murder weapon was recovered from Vigil and Valdez during that stop. Howard was apprehended shortly afterward. The three were charged with first-degree murder. Vigil and Howard were tried together in April and May of 2019, and the scope of their criminal conduct during this period was considerably wider than the Janacek murder alone. The day after the parking lot shooting, the same group allegedly committed an armed robbery at a Lakewood cell phone store. Howard was also linked to a shooting at a residential address in Arvada connected to witness intimidation in a separate matter. These additional charges multiplied the counts against both men substantially. Vigil was convicted on 16 counts and received life in prison without parole plus 118 years. Howard was convicted on 18 counts and received life plus 279 years. Valdez's separate trial in July of 2019 lasted 6 days. The jury deliberated, accounts vary on the length, with some reporting a single day and others noting up to 6, before convicting her of first-degree felony murder, attempted aggravated robbery, and conspiracy to commit robbery. On August 23, 2019, she was sentenced to life without parole plus 16 years. She is currently serving that sentence at the Denver Women's Correctional Facility. No court could give Andrew Janacek's family the thing they most needed, which was to have him back. His girlfriend had sent him out for takeout dinner. His family had, by all accounts, known him as someone gentle and caring, someone whose interests and personality reflected nothing of the world that reached into that parking lot and ended his evening permanently. The randomness of it is part of what makes it so difficult to absorb. The knowledge that he had done everything right, that there was no decision he could have made differently to change the outcome, because his killers had selected him not for who he was, but simply for where he was standing. There is no comfort to be found in that, and the sentences handed down do not provide it. What they provide is accountability, which is a different thing entirely, and a lesser one. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Case 4. Karina Rose Miñarez. This is one of the most horrifying true crime stories this state has ever produced. The account of a Pueblo, Colorado woman convicted of killing 2 small children who'd been placed in her care and then concealing their bodies so thoroughly, so methodically, and so ruthlessly that the world did not find out those children were gone for more than 5 years. 5 years. Jesus Dominguez Jr. was 5 years old. His sister Yesenia was 3. She was in her early 30s when the killings occurred around 2018. What kind of darkness lives inside a person who conceal a child's remains in concrete, drive around with a suitcase in their trunk for years, and never once make a call, send a message, or breathe a word to anyone about what happened? Is there any way to understand a silence that complete? But what happened inside that Pueblo home that led to the deaths of 2 children this young? Let's jump into the details of this case to find out. Karina Rose Miñarez was the girlfriend of Jesus Dominguez, the children's father, in the city of Pueblo, Colorado, around 2018. The environment the children lived in was defined by substance use,
Both Miñarez and Dominguez were using drugs, including methamphetamine and Percocet, and by the kind of daily dysfunction that substance dependence tends to produce in a household where young children are present. Dominguez later testified about the conditions inside the home and about the dynamics that preceded the children's deaths. He described frustration connected to normal developmental challenges, specifically the process of toilet training, which is among the most ordinary and temporary of childhood stages, and which was treated in this household as a source of escalating conflict and punishment. The children endured treatment that no child should experience. Evidence presented at trial included practices like confining the children in plastic bags during car trips to prevent accidents from soiling the vehicle's interior. These were not isolated incidents. Both children died under circumstances prosecutors characterized as homicidal violence. The precise physical mechanism of each death could not be definitively established due to the condition of the remains by the time they were recovered, but prosecutors made clear, and the jury agreed, that natural or accidental causes were not consistent with the evidence. Signs of physical struggle were present. The deaths occurred while the children were in Miñarez's care, and Dominguez's testimony placed the pattern of escalating harm directly in that context.
What followed the children's deaths was a concealment effort that lasted more than 5 years. For Yesenia, whose body was initially stored in a bag and later transferred to a suitcase, the ultimate concealment involved a rented storage unit at the King's Storage Center on the 600 block of West 6th Street in Pueblo. The storage container was filled with concrete, purchased by Miñarez using her own credit card. The remains were encased inside it. For Jesus Jr., the suitcase containing his remains was placed in the trunk of a vehicle belonging to Miñarez, which was subsequently abandoned at a local scrapyard, where it remained for years. Dominguez later testified that the couple had at times driven with one set of remains in the vehicle while continuing their day-to-day activities. The children had not been enrolled in school. No one had reported them missing. The apparatus of the state that might have noticed their absence had no knowledge they had ever existed to disappear. The discovery came in January of 2024. A 911 call reporting a suspicious metal container led investigators to the storage unit. When the concrete was broken apart, decomposed remains were found inside. 2 weeks later, the suitcase with the boys' remains was located in the trunk of the abandoned car at the scrapyard. DNA testing confirmed the identities of both children as the Dominguez children. Miñarez and Dominguez were arrested in February of 2024. Dominguez entered a guilty plea in July of 2025 to 1 count of second-degree murder, with other charges dismissed in exchange for his cooperation and testimony. He received 32 years. Miñarez went to trial in Pueblo in August of 2025, maintaining her innocence throughout an 11-day proceeding. The jury deliberated for approximately 1 day before returning guilty verdicts on all counts: 2 counts of first-degree murder of a child under 12 by a person in a position of trust, and 2 counts related to the handling of the remains. Judge Patrick Romero imposed the sentence immediately: 2 consecutive life terms without parole. Miñarez was 37 years old at conviction. Dominguez's testimony provided significant detail about the period of time during which the children were alive and suffering, and about the period afterward during which both adults chose concealment over accountability. His own expressed remorse and his acknowledgement that he had left the children alone with someone he knew to be harmful exists in complicated tension with the sentence he received in exchange for cooperating. The jury's verdict directed the weight of accountability toward Miñarez. The system's response to both of them is a matter that reasonable people continue to evaluate differently. What does not invite different evaluation is the silence that surrounded these 2 children's lives and deaths for more than 5 years, the absence of anyone to notice, anyone to ask, anyone to call. Jesus Jr. was 5. Yesenia was 3. The years between their deaths and the discovery of what remained of them represent one of the longest silences in this documentary. Case 5. Leah Ackerson. Picture coming home after a few days away, opening your own front door, and walking straight into something so unthinkable that no lock, no alarm, and no precaution could ever have prepared you for it. Leah Ackerson, a Colorado woman who, in the middle of a bitter mountain winter, broke into the home of a 74-year-old woman she had never met, hid inside that home for days, and then, when the homeowner finally returned, took part in strangling her to death inside the very house she had spent a lifetime building. Leah Ackerson was in her mid-20s when the killing took place around January 24, 2018. Her victim was Catherine Kelly, a 74-year-old woman who lived alone in the Pilgrim Downs subdivision near Edwards in Eagle County, described by everyone who loved her as vibrant, warm, and irreplaceable. But was Leah Ackerson a predator or a prisoner of someone else's design? Let's jump into the details of this case to find out. Catherine Kelly was 74 years old and lived alone in the Pilgrim Downs subdivision near Edwards, Colorado, in Eagle County. Her family described her as vibrant and deeply connected to the people around her, the kind of person who could not be made smaller by age, whose presence in a room registered with everyone in it. She had a large home in an area that conveyed to someone in difficult circumstances looking for an empty property the impression of space and resources. Ackerson and White, who were married and living in Denver, were facing circumstances that credible reporting characterized as homeless or severely housing insecure, seeking warmth and food in the middle of winter. They did not arrive at Kelly's home unprepared. Prosecutors established that the couple brought weapons, knives, rope, and a hatchet, which indicated an intention that extended beyond merely seeking temporary shelter. Around January 24, 2018, while Kelly was away, White used the hatchet to break through a ground-floor bathroom window. The couple entered the home and remained inside, hidden for at least 1 to 2 days. They used the space, consumed food, and went undetected while the house's owner was absent. Then, Kelly returned. Accounts of what happened next are shaped by contested claims. What the physical evidence confirmed is that the encounter between Kelly and the two intruders ended with her death. Kelly was strangled. White admitted to this in his subsequent guilty plea, and there was also evidence that Ackerson had attempted to use a knife against Kelly during the confrontation. Prosecutors presented the attack as a decision made to eliminate a witness and complete the robbery of the home. The couple then took items from the residence and left. Kelly's body was found covered with blankets near the master bathroom area after a neighbor, concerned by her absence, contacted police and deputies were dispatched. The discovery was made on January 24th or 25th, 2018. Ackerson's defense at her 2020 trial rested substantially on the claim that she had been a victim of domestic abuse within her relationship with White, and that her participation in both the home invasion and the events that followed it was shaped by his control over her. She testified in her own defense, describing herself as someone who had been unable to prevent what White did and who deserved the jury's understanding on that basis. She had declined a plea offer, reported to be in the range of 64 years, slightly less than the sentence White had accepted, and went to trial, betting that the jury would evaluate her culpability differently than the prosecution did. The jury deliberated for 27 hours before returning its verdicts. They convicted Ackerson on 6 of 9 counts, including felony murder, first-degree burglary, aggravated robbery, and related conspiracy and trespass charges. They acquitted her of first-degree murder after deliberation, and the conspiracy charge tied to premeditated murder specifically. The distinction was consequential in some ways and ultimately irrelevant in the one way that mattered most. The felony murder conviction carried a mandatory sentence of life without parole under Colorado law because the death had occurred during the commission of the underlying burglary and robbery, regardless of whether Ackerson had personally strangled Kelly or intended her death in advance. Judge Russell Granger sentenced her on December 18, 2020, to life without parole plus 48 years for the additional counts. At sentencing, Ackerson wept and asked for mercy, described herself as a wonderful woman who had stood up for herself, and announced her intention to appeal. She said she did not feel guilty in the eyes of anyone who had ever truly known her. The judge acknowledged the complexity of the domestic abuse claims and the role White had played, but held firm. She had participated in planning the burglary, she had brought weapons to a stranger's home, and she had been present when a 74-year-old woman who offered her kindness lost her life as a result. White had accepted 68 years in exchange for his guilty plea, with parole eligibility after 51 years. He expressed remorse. Ackerson's appeals, including constitutional challenges to the mandatory nature of the life sentence for felony murder, where the defendant did not directly cause the death, were denied by the Colorado Court of Appeals and, as of 2025, by the Colorado Supreme Court as well. Catherine Kelly's daughter described sleepless nights and permanent fear. She said the crime was apocalyptic, that the word sounded too large until she tried to explain what had been done to her mother, and then it was the only word that fit. Case 6. Jill Coate. Some people lie occasionally. Some lie often. And then there are people who lie so completely, for so long, that when violence finally follows, somehow it still manages to catch everyone off guard. Jill Coate had been married 11 times to 9 different men, used multiple aliases across several states, was suspected in the violent death of a previous husband, and ultimately hired an accomplice to break into a Colorado man's home and shoot him 3 times in the chest, 4 days before a court hearing she could not afford to lose. She was approximately 50 years old when the murder took place on October 22, 1993. The main victim of this heartbreaking story was Gerald Boggs, a 52-year-old hardware store owner in Steamboat Springs, Colorado. By every account, a straightforward, decent man who would try to resolve a dispute with her the way ordinary people do, through the courts, believing the system would protect him. But what finally made Jill Coate decide that murder was the answer? Let's find out what drove her to commit such an offense. Jill Coate was born in Louisiana around 1943 or 44. Her early life is not extensively documented in public records, and her own accounts of it were not reliably consistent. What the documentary record confirms is that by the time she was in her 30s, she had established the behavioral pattern that would define the rest of her life: multiple simultaneous marriages, aliases, financial schemes, and a capacity for presenting herself to new people as entirely credible, warm, and trustworthy. Her third husband, William Clark Coate, died under violent circumstances in Houston in 1972. She was suspected but never charged. That case was never resolved. Coate married several more times in the years that followed. She married Gerald Boggs, a mild-mannered man known for his consistency and good nature in Steamboat Springs. The marriage collapsed quickly. It emerged that Coate was still legally married to another man, a situation she had managed before, and the marriage to Boggs was annulled in 1991. What followed was a civil dispute between them, involving financial claims and unresolved property issues from the marriage and its dissolution. A hearing in that civil matter was scheduled for late October of 1993. Prosecutors later argued that this hearing and the financial exposure it represented was the proximate cause of what Coate decided to do about Gerald Boggs. Through the summer and early fall of 1993, Coate sought someone to resolve her problem through violence. She approached multiple people, offering payment. She discussed the idea with people who later testified about those conversations. When no one would act, she turned to her boyfriend, Michael Backus, a telephone repairman, who agreed to accompany and assist her. On October 22, 1993, the two went to Boggs's home on West Hillside Court in Steamboat Springs. Both wore disguises. Coate had dressed as a man, altering her appearance substantially. They gained entry to the residence. The attack involved multiple methods of harm. They used a stun device to incapacitate Boggs, then struck him with a shovel they found at the scene, and then shot him 3 times in the chest with a .22 caliber pistol they had brought with them. Boggs did not survive. His brother Doug discovered the body the following morning after Gerald failed to appear at the family hardware store. The scene was, as Coate herself would later acknowledge in a phone call to her son Seth, a mess. She used those words. Investigators, piecing together what had happened, quickly identified the impending civil litigation as the likely motive and Coate as the most obvious person to have acted on it. Coate and Backus fled, heading toward Mexico, but they were arrested in December of 1993. Their trial was held in Hot Sulphur Springs after a venue change from Steamboat Springs, and it opened in the spring of 1995. The prosecution's evidence included testimony from Coate's son Seth, given with immunity, about the phone call she made after the killing and about the conversations she had with him in the planning period. Other witnesses testified that she had solicited them to participate in the murder beforehand. Forensic evidence tied the couple to the scene and the method. Both Coate and Backus were convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy on March 17, 1995. Sentencing on May 24, 1995, produced life without parole for both, along with additional years on the conspiracy charge and a $1 million fine levied against Coit specifically to prevent her from profiting through any future media or publishing arrangement connected to the case. Appeals in 1997 and again in 22 were unsuccessful for both defendants. Backus also pursued unsuccessful efforts to obtain a new trial. Jill Coit remains at the Denver Women's Correctional Facility, where she has been since her conviction 30 years ago. She has not been without legal activity in the intervening period. She filed suits alleging various mistreatments in custody, attempted what were characterized as internet-based schemes from inside the prison in its earlier years, and continued to generate paperwork in ways that suggested her capacity for strategic maneuvering did not diminish with incarceration. Gerald Boggs was 52 years old when she and Backus killed him, 4 days before the civil hearing that threatened her financial interests. He was, by every account, a straightforward and decent man whose habits and routines made him predictable enough that those with bad intentions could plan around them. In the span of his life after the annulment, before the civil proceeding, he had simply been trying to resolve a dispute through the courts, the way ordinary people do when they believe the system will protect them. It did not. Case 7. Jennifer Reale. What would it take for someone to convince you, genuinely convince you, that killing another person was not only acceptable, but something you were actually meant to do? Take a moment to process this question in your mind. Jennifer Reale, a wife and mother who disguised herself in camouflage and a ski mask, waited outside a community center in the dark and shot another woman she barely knew twice at point-blank range. A woman whose only crime was being married to the man Jennifer Reale had been sleeping with. Jennifer Reale was 28 years old when she committed this crime on September 12, 1990. The woman she murdered was Diane Hood, a 32-year-old woman battling lupus, a woman who had done nothing to anyone. But what was it that Jennifer Reale was told that made her believe killing Diane Hood was something she was supposed to do? Let's jump into the details of this case to find out. Jennifer Reale was 28 years old in the spring of 1990. She was married to an officer in the United States Army and was raising 2 young children in Colorado Springs. By any surface measure, her life looked like a life that was working. In May of 1990, Brian Hood came to her door to sell life insurance. He was married to a woman named Diane, who was 32 and had been living with lupus, a serious autoimmune condition that caused her chronic pain and significant physical limitation. What began as a professional visit evolved relatively quickly into an affair that would become one of the most documented and analyzed cases in Colorado criminal history. Brian Hood, according to prosecutors and multiple witnesses, was not simply a man conducting an extramarital relationship. He was, in the framing the evidence supported, a man who used the affair as an instrument, who selected Jennifer Reale not only for whatever she offered personally, but because she was someone he believed he could shape. He held strong Christian views, or presented himself as holding them, and he deployed those views strategically. He told Reale that their physical relationship made them one in spirit. He told her that his wife's suffering from lupus was a burden on everyone, including Diane herself, and that ending that suffering would be an act of mercy. He referenced Scripture. He framed what he was asking as something God had sanctioned and perhaps required. He asked Jennifer Reale to kill his wife. There were attempts before September 12, 2090, multiple occasions on which the plan was put in motion and abandoned, suggesting both the planning involved and the psychological weight Reale was under as the scheme progressed. Prosecutors noted that she had purchased the weapon herself. The defense emphasized that Brian had provided the disguise, camouflage fatigues and a ski mask, and had told her to fire twice to ensure the outcome. Both things can be simultaneously true, and the legal system was ultimately asked to weigh them against each other. On September 12, 1990, Diane Hood attended the Lupus Support Group meeting at the Otis Park Community Center in Colorado Springs. When she left the meeting with a friend and walked toward her vehicle, Reale was waiting. She was dressed in the camouflage clothing and wore the mask. She fired once. Diane fell. Diane reportedly pleaded with her attacker. Reale fired again. The friend who witnessed this could not identify the masked shooter immediately. Reale fled the scene. 2 days later, on September 14, 1990, she gave a confession to police and provided the details of the affair, the planning, and the role Brian Hood had played in engineering it. Both were arrested. Brian Hood was tried separately. He was acquitted of first-degree murder, but convicted of second-degree murder and conspiracy, and of criminal solicitation. He received 37 years. Riali was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy. She received life without parole. A significant controversy during the trial period involved the sharing of attorney files between the defense teams and prosecutors, which generated claims about attorney-client privilege and Fifth Amendment rights that were raised in Riali's subsequent appeals. The sentencing disparity became a flashpoint. Riali, who had pulled the trigger, who had been present, who had fired twice, received life. Hood, who had conceived the plan, provided the disguise, and directed the execution from safety, received less. Those who argued for proportionality in sentencing noted the apparent inversion. Supporters of the original outcome noted that Hood's acquittal on first-degree murder reflected the jury's assessment of his specific culpability, and that the sentences reflected what the evidence supported in each separate proceeding. In 2011, outgoing Governor Bill Ritter commuted Riali's sentence to make her parole eligible at a point comparable to Hood's timeline, citing the shared nature of the criminal enterprise. The decision drew immediate criticism from Diane Hood's family and from law enforcement officials who had worked the case. Parole hearings between 2014 and 2017 denied her release multiple times. In December of 2017, the board approved her release. She had been in custody for more than 25 years. She died of pancreatic cancer in March of 2018, 3 months after leaving prison. She was 55 years old. Diane Hood was 32. She had lupus. She went to a support group meeting the evening she died, the way people with serious illnesses do, not because it solves anything, but because sitting with others who understand something about what you are carrying can make the weight a little lighter. She walked out of that meeting toward her car. She had no idea what was waiting. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Case 8. Liesl Alman. Imagine you were sitting in the back of a police car, handcuffed, going nowhere, and somewhere behind you, a gun goes off. Now ask yourself, could you be convicted of that murder? This is perhaps the most legally explosive true crime story in Colorado history. The account of a 21-year-old Liesl Alman who was convicted of first-degree murder for a killing she did not commit, did not witness, and had no power to stop because she was already sitting in handcuffs in the back of a police cruiser when the fatal shot was fired. She was 21 years old when the events unfolded on November 12, 1997. There is a legal doctrine in the United States that extends criminal liability beyond the moment of a crime into the period of flight from it, a recognition that the danger created by a felony does not end the instant the felony itself is completed. Under Colorado's felony murder rule as applied in 1997, a person who participated in a felony that set off a chain of events resulting in a death could be held responsible for that death, even if they did not fire a shot, even if they were not present at the moment of the killing, and even, as the case of Liesl Alman demonstrated, if they had already been taken into police custody before the fatal confrontation occurred. The question of whether that doctrine, applied under those specific circumstances, produced a just outcome occupied courts, legal scholars, prominent public advocates, and the Colorado Supreme Court for nearly a decade. The victim of this tragic story was Officer Bruce Vanderjagt, a 47-year-old Denver police officer with 23 years of service, shot and killed by an armed fugitive during a chaotic street pursuit, a decorated officer who never came home that night. But was Liesl Alman a murderer or a cautionary tale about how far a legal doctrine can reach? Let's jump into the details of this case to find out. Liesl Alman was 21 years old in November of 1997. She was living in the Denver area and had recently separated from a boyfriend whose apartment she needed to access to retrieve her belongings. On November 12, 1997, she enlisted the help of acquaintances she had met only recently, including a 26-year-old named Matthias Janig, who had a documented history of legal trouble and connections to extremist circles, and a woman named Demetria Soriano. The group drove to the former boyfriend's apartment located outside Denver. The intent, as Allman would later describe it, was simply to collect her things. The legal characterization of what actually occurred was burglary, a felony, with the consequences that the statute attached to that classification. Police responded to reports of the break-in. As officers arrived, the group fled in a vehicle. A pursuit developed through Denver area streets, during which gunfire was exchanged. While the chase was still in progress, officers caught up with the vehicle and Allman was removed from the car, handcuffed and secured in the back of a Denver police patrol car. She was, at that point, in police custody. She was not armed. She was not free to act or flee or direct anyone's movements. What happened next, she had no capacity to influence. Janig fled on foot and took cover at a nearby condominium complex. He was armed with a rifle. Officer Bruce Vanderjagt, 47 years old and a 23-year veteran of the Denver Police Department, was part of the team that moved to apprehend Janig. In the confrontation that followed, Janig opened fire, striking Officer Vanderjagt multiple times. Vanderjagt, who was in the process of advancing with his colleagues, did not survive. Janig died at the scene. Allman, handcuffed in the patrol car throughout, heard the gunfire but had no part in what occurred. The prosecution's theory of the case rested on the felony murder rule. Because the shooting of Officer Vanderjagt occurred during the flight from the burglary in which Allman had participated, she was legally responsible for his death. Her jury trial in 1998 lasted 10 days. After several hours of deliberation, the jury convicted her of first-degree felony murder, second-degree burglary, menacing, and conspiracy to commit first-degree burglary. She was acquitted of first-degree burglary itself. The conviction carried Colorado's mandatory sentence, life in prison without parole. She was 21 years old at conviction. The public response was substantial. Gonzo journalist Hunter S. Thompson, who made the case a platform in the early 2000s, described Allman as, in his framing, a person uniquely wronged by the legal system, likely the only individual in the country ever convicted of felony murder while sitting in police custody at the time of the killing. Thompson wrote about her extensively, including a piece in Vanity Fair, and enlisted the musician Warren Zevon, among others, in drawing national attention to her situation. The characterization of her conviction as a miscarriage of justice gained considerable traction, particularly among those who felt the felony murder doctrine had been stretched beyond what fairness or proportionality could sustain. In 2022, the Colorado Court of Appeals affirmed the conviction. In March of 2025, the Colorado Supreme Court reversed it, not because the felony murder rule itself was invalid, but because the jury instructions on the predicate burglary charge had been flawed in ways that may have compromised Allman's right to a fair determination. Rather than face a retrial, Allman accepted a plea agreement, guilty to burglary and accessory to first-degree murder, with a 20-year sentence in community corrections and credit for the approximately 8 years she had already served. She was released to a halfway house and later freed around 2026. Officer Bruce Vanderjagt's widow, processing the years and the proceedings that followed, eventually expressed support for the plea agreement as part of her own process of reaching some form of resolution. The case left behind it a set of legal questions that did not resolve neatly. What does meaningful participation in a crime require? At what point does the chain of causation connecting a predicate felony to a resulting death become too extended for individual culpability to hold? And what does it mean for the integrity of the law when the person convicted of a killing was in handcuffs before the killing began? These questions do not have simple answers, and the Colorado Supreme Court's ruling was careful to avoid providing them. What it provided was a procedural remedy, not an exoneration, not a declaration of innocence, but a recognition that the original trial had not been conducted on sound enough footing to justify keeping Allman in prison for the rest of her life.
Case 9. Kelly Baker. Think about the people closest to you, the ones sitting at your table, sharing your life. Now ask yourself honestly, would you ever truly know if they were planning to have you killed? I know this must be a very uncomfortable question for you to answer, but as you wrestle with the weight of this question, let me tell you the story of Kelly Baker, a Colorado woman who allegedly spent months sending thousands of messages seething with hatred about her own husband, quietly assembled a network of his closest family members to help her have him killed, and then calmly called 911 after his body was found, pretending she had no idea what had happened. She was in her 50s when the murder took place on the night of August 15th into August 16th, 2017. Her victim was Randy Baker, a 59-year-old substance abuse counselor in Greeley, a man who had fought his way back from addiction, heart damage, and rock bottom to become someone who genuinely saved other people's lives, including members of the very family that conspired against him. But what had really been building inside Kelly Baker's marriage for all those months? Let's jump into the details of this case to find out. Randy Baker was 59 years old when he died on August 16, 2017, at his home in West Greeley, Colorado. His story before that night was one of substantial hardship, followed by genuine transformation. An electrocution accident at the age of 28, while working as a power company lineman, had left him with permanent heart damage. The pain that followed led to addiction, to drugs, then to alcohol, then to the period of his life in which he was selling narcotics. He entered rehabilitation, achieved sobriety, and redirected whatever he had learned from his own struggle into helping others through theirs. He became a substance abuse counselor. He supported family members and friends who were fighting the same battles he had fought. People in his life credited him with saving them. His ex-wife Dory said he had saved her life. By spring of 2017, Randy's health had declined again. A heart surgery in June that year intensified the pressures on his marriage to Kelly, who had been working as a hairdresser and by that point in the marriage had also taken on the role of his caretaker. Kelly moved out shortly after the surgery. She began a relationship with another man. She told investigators that she found Randy increasingly difficult, that she believed he would never leave her alone, that she saw no path out of the marriage that did not involve his continued presence in her life. What she did not tell investigators, at least not initially, was that she stood to receive more than $130,000 in life insurance payouts upon his death, along with the couple's home and other assets. She initially told police the insurance amount was $10,000.
The network Kelly assembled to carry out the plan involved Randy's own family. Carol Baker was Randy's older sister and Kelly's close friend, despite the tension in Carol's own relationship with her brother. Carol became the communications intermediary, exchanging more than 4,500 text messages with Kelly in the months leading up to August. The messages described, as prosecutors put it at trial, seething hatred directed toward Randy. Carol's son, Kelly Raisley, known as Grizz, became the person who would carry out the act in exchange for cash in the range of $10,000 to $13,000 and Randy's Harley-Davidson motorcycle. As recently as 2015, Raisley had sent texts describing Randy as a great man and a father figure. By the summer of 2017, he had agreed to kill him for money and a motorcycle. Randy Baker was shot twice at his home on the evening of August 15th or early morning of August 16th, 2017. He had been through a drive-thru earlier in the evening. His fast food was spilled on the floor near where he fell. Raisley took Randy's wallet, keys, and vehicle, abandoning the car days later in a South Greeley alley with a license plate removed. Carol Baker had been at the house earlier that day performing household tasks before leaving. Kelly Baker had established an alibi through her affair partner and called 911, reporting what she framed as a possible medical event given Randy's known heart condition. The investigation threaded through phone records, the thousands of texts, the contact saved in Kelly's phone under the alias Sonia that traced back to Raisley and eventually to Raisley's own admission. He had pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in May of 2018, a deal that removed the possibility of the death penalty in exchange for cooperation and received life without parole. At Kelly's trial in May of 2019, he took the stand but offered limited testimony about the planning, citing fears of what cooperation would mean for him in a prison environment. Despite his reluctance, the documentary record assembled by prosecutors was comprehensive enough that the jury required approximately 1 hour to convict Kelly Baker on both counts: first-degree murder after deliberation and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. Judge Shannon Lyons sentenced her on May 24, 2019, to life without parole on the murder charge and 48 consecutive years on the conspiracy count. At sentencing, Kelly addressed the court and offered what those present characterized as a suggestion that her actions had been part of some larger plan beyond her own choices. The judge was explicit in his response. He acknowledged that the marriage may have been difficult. He acknowledged that Kelly's account of Randy's behavior, even if accepted as entirely true, would not change the fundamental equation. Randy Baker did not deserve to die. The life Randy Baker had built, the sobriety, the counseling, the people he had helped pull back from the edges of their own worst moments, was taken from him by the people he was surrounded by, the ones who should have been closest to him. Randy's daughter stood at sentencing holding her infant son who bore his grandfather's name. The child would never know the man whose name he carried. Case 10. Malaika Tamu Griffin. If you committed the worst act of your life today, how long do you think you could run from it? 1 year? 2? Maybe 3? Well, Malaika Tamu Griffin managed to run from her crimes for 6 years. She shot her neighbor once in the back on a Denver street in broad daylight, stole a car at gunpoint to make her escape, and then vanished so completely and so skillfully that she spent the next 6 years living under a false identity, working at a biotechnology firm in California, and graduating magna cum laude from college, while the man she killed stayed dead and his family waited for justice that took 2.5 decades to arrive. She was in her 20s when the murder took place on May 18, 1999. The man she killed was Jason Patrick Horsley, a 25-year-old carpenter from Wyoming, shot once through the heart from behind while unloading tools from his truck outside his apartment on Humboldt Street in Denver. But what was the real reason Malaika Tamu Griffin went back inside her apartment and came out with a gun? Let's jump into the details of this case to find out. Jason Patrick Horsley, the unfortunate victim of this story, was 25 years old on May 18, 1999, when he died on the 2300 block of Humboldt Street in Denver. He had come from Wyoming originally and worked as a carpenter. He was Griffin's next-door neighbor in the building they both lived in. What the evidence assembled by investigators and later presented at trial described was a verbal argument that broke out between them while Horsley was outside his residence unloading tools from his truck. Arguments between neighbors occur constantly in every urban neighborhood. They almost never end in the way this one did. What set this particular argument on the path it took was what Griffin did when she went inside. She returned to her apartment, retrieved a 9mm handgun equipped with a laser sight, came back outside, and approached Horsley from behind. She fired once. The shots struck him in the back and pierced his heart. He died immediately. A witness named Deborah discovered him at his truck. After the shooting, Griffin committed additional crimes in the process of escape. She took a vehicle at gunpoint from another person and fled the scene, abandoning the vehicle in another state as she moved first through the Midwest and then west toward California. Investigators who searched Griffin's apartment found materials that became the center of the trial's most contested evidentiary question. Her personal diary and notebooks contained written passages expressing intense racial animosity toward white people, including language that was specific, violent, and unambiguous in its emotional register. Prosecutors introduced excerpts from these writings to establish motive and the premeditated nature of the act, arguing that the argument with Horsley, a white man, had not been a random escalation, but had occurred against the backdrop of documented hatred that made the outcome, once the argument began, not entirely unpredictable. They argued the writings reflected real beliefs, rather than creative or fictional exercises. Griffin testified in her own defense in the 2026 trial, offering two primary arguments. She claimed self-defense, that Horsley had threatened her during the argument, that she had perceived him reaching toward his truck for a weapon, and that the shot had been fired in response to that perceived threat. She also claimed that the notebook writings were not expressions of her actual views, but were materials she was developing for a play or novel, fictional voices she was exploring as part of a creative project, not personal declarations of belief. The jury deliberated for approximately 7 hours before rejecting both arguments. They convicted her on all counts: first-degree murder after deliberation, aggravated robbery, and aggravated motor vehicle theft. Griffin appealed the conviction to the Colorado Court of Appeals in 2029, raising several grounds: that her trial attorney had not been properly licensed to practice in Colorado, which she argued constituted a structural violation of her rights; that the notebook writings had been improperly admitted; that the jury instructions on self-defense had been flawed; and that prosecutorial conduct had been improper. The Court of Appeals issued its ruling on April 16, 2029, denying all claims and affirming the convictions on every count. No subsequent appeal or motion appears to have altered the outcome in ways reflected in credible public records. She received an automatic sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, which was the mandatory consequence for a first-degree murder conviction in Colorado at the time. She is serving that sentence, according to various source accounts, at La Vista Correctional Facility in Pueblo. The aggravated robbery and motor vehicle theft convictions added 10 years. Colorado formally abolished the death penalty in 2020, though even in 1999, the prosecution in this case did not pursue capital charges. The 6-year flight is, in some ways, the detail that most reveals something about Griffin's self-assessment after the shooting. She did not turn herself in. She did not remain in Denver and face the consequences of what she had done. She used her education, her professional credentials, and her intelligence to construct a life that could continue while the investigation stalled, hoping, apparently, that the gap between who she was in California and what she had done in Denver would never close. The America's Most Wanted broadcast closed it. That is how these things often end, not with the fugitive making a final reckoning, but with a phone call from someone who recognized a face on a screen and decided to pick up the phone. Jason Horsley was 25 years old. He was unloading tools from his truck on a May afternoon. His neighbor went inside, made a decision, and came back with a weapon. That is the whole of the sequence, and nothing in the years of flight, in the alias, in the biotechnology career in California changed a single detail of it. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like to subscribe.